Good afternoon. Welcome to our first summer webinar. We are joined today by our resident ecosystem analyst, Ella Milne, and she'll be introducing you to Ecology technology, the latest in tech for surveys, monitoring and land management. Ella's presentation should be around 45 minutes today, and there will be a chance at the end to ask some questions. Can I just please ask you all to pop your questions into the chat? We'll try and answer a few as we go along if they're pretty simple for us to answer. But then also I'll be posing a few to Ella at the end. It's worth noting that the session today is recorded, and I will email you all a copy of the link within a couple of days as well, so you'll all have access to that post-event. I think that's everything I need to cover, so I shall hand you over to Ella. Enjoy the chat with Ella. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Kate. And thank you everyone for joining this session on ecology technology. There's so many exciting new developments in technology used in industry, and not enough time in 45 minutes to touch on them all, but I want to give a bit of a whistle-stop tour on some of the really great tech that I've had first-hand experience using, and some of the tech that I think is really changing biodiversity monitoring, and some really cool applications going on in the world as well. So as Kate said, I am an ecosystem analyst based in the innovation team at Ecosystem. So I work on the development and application of new technology-based approaches and metrics to scale nature restoration. But my background, my academic background is actually in animal movement ecology, where I did my master's at Swansea University's Lab for Animal Movement, which is a world-leading lab for the development of animal movement tracking technology. And a little bit about Ecosystem. We're the first UK business to centre our purpose around rewilding. We take a technology and science-based approach to nature restoration. So we use tech to monitor rewilding sites, gather data, and it's helping us make evidence-based decisions to scale nature recovery. And this is really in line with our company mission, which is to accelerate global rewilding. So the rapid development of technology and ecology is really exciting. You know, every other day I'm seeing a new scientific publication on eDNA or bioacoustic research. And we know that ecosystems are complex and dynamic, and the relationships among the components within an ecosystem are quite difficult to measure. So technology developments have really been the catalyst for our better understanding of ecosystem function and dynamics. So it's a really exciting time to be in the sector. And we're seeing increasingly complex research questions being asked, and global challenges are driving the development, the refinement, and the different uses of technology and ecology. And these technologies have the potential to revolutionise the sector by providing that next generation ecological data and better biodiversity indicators. So this is a really great figure to show the shift in conservation technology developments. Most of the technology and devices used in ecology and conservation were originally developed for other purposes, like the government, military and medical, and then they were later adopted by the conservation community, such as like GPS processing units, which were modified to create wildlife tracking collars. But we're now starting to see a bit of a shift, moving from that current role as technology consumers, which is shown in the figure as the classic model, to technology drivers and innovators, which is shown as the alternative model in the figure. And the conservation community are now driving the creation of new technology, which is giving us access to newer, cheaper and more specialised tech to a larger part of the ecological industry. And this tech development often involves interdisciplinary teams of ecologists, engineers, computer scientists. And this is one of the reasons I love this field. It requires close collaboration and partnerships with multiple different disciplines. So I'm going to dive right into it with bioacoustic monitoring. So bioacoustics is the study of environmental sound, and it's a rapidly growing field with already groundbreaking applications for biodiversity monitoring. But why do we need to monitor this? Well, animals use sound for communication, echolocation, mating and territorial defence. And by recording these sounds, we can understand things like animal distribution, physiological state, abundance and behaviour, and more about their acoustic environment, which is known as the soundscape, which I'll talk a bit about further. And it's great because it's a cost-effective, reliable, scalable and repeatable approach. And many acoustic sensors can be deployed in the field for weeks or months and collect recordings on wildlife in a non-invasive way. So bioacoustics has been used for a long time by ecologists, but usually only to monitor bats. And now there's expanding applications in ecology, and in a rewilding context, bioacoustics can be used for baseline monitoring, which is a crucial part of any rewilding project. You know, we need to establish a reference point where we can compare against in the future. It's also great for detecting specific species on a site, which might be rarer, harder to see, or maybe nocturnal. And these are just some of the few developed acoustic sensors for biodiversity monitoring. So the Audio Moth by Open Acoustic Devices is a low-cost, open source and full spectrum acoustic logger, which means it can record in a whole range of frequencies, from birds to bats, and open source meaning that the data is compatible with many data analysis options. And then the Hydra Moth is a variant of the Audio Moth, but it's designed for underwater recording. And the Micro Moth, which is, I think it only weighs 5 grams. It's slightly bigger than standard SD card, and it's the micro sized version of the Audio Moth. And this is developed to be mounted onto animals, which is really cool, such as birds. Then Wildlife Acoustics have developed multiple acoustic sensors, such as the Song Meter SM4 and the Mini. And these are industry standard wildlife audio recording devices. So they're engineered to deliver really quality sound of recordings of birds and frogs and other vocal animals. And they can also store terabytes of data and record in the field for months at a time. And they've also got a really good detection range. Then there's Poly, which is a field sensor device developed by a company called Agrisound. And they use advanced bioacoustic algorithms to automate insect monitoring. Then we've got Anabat, which is an industry standard bat detector, which a lot of ecologists will currently use. And then there's various soil, water hydrophones. This one was developed by Frontier Labs. So soundscape ecology is an emerging field of research. In a biodiverse and healthy ecosystem, you get a very complex and saturated soundscape. And this is because animals compete for the soundscape resource, which allows them to be heard, defend territories, find a mate, and communicate. And this has led to the evolution of different species occupying different sound frequencies or amplifications, also known as acoustic niches. So, for example, birds occupy between 1 and 8 kilohertz, but then different species will occupy different frequency bands within that. And then insects range between 4 and 20 kilohertz, and bats between 9 and 200 kilohertz, so ultrasonic. And then most anthropogenic or like human created noise is between 1 and 2 kilohertz. So a diverse habitat with an associated diversity of species will have a higher acoustic diversity. So using this soundscape approach can allow a site to be compared to a baseline or a benchmark to show change over time. But how can we quantify soundscapes or add meaning to the soundscape recordings? So many acoustic indices have been developed and are being used to analyse soundscapes and understand biodiversity. An acoustic index is a single value that can summarise a particular aspect of an acoustic space, maybe like pitch or saturation or frequency or amplitude, or the variation and diversity with those aspects. And although there has been some really promising research and results with correlations between species diversity and acoustic diversity, it's also important to bear in mind that there can be competing explanations for a particular value. So, for example, acoustic complexity can be really high if you've got high bird activity and high bird diversity, but also it can be high if there's a storm and there's heavy rainfall. So it might be useful to monitor other environmental factors such as weather, as well as acoustic monitoring. So ecoscientists are using audio moths at the moment to monitor changes in bat species richness and activity levels on rewilding sites. And audio moths are great because they're cheaper than traditional bat detectors, and we can send a big batch of them out to a landowner for a small cost with a protocol. And we've also been using the BTO acoustic pipeline, which is a cutting edge algorithm developed by the BTO, where you can upload raw acoustic files and then the pipeline automatically IDs the bat species and returns the results. And this is great because it's much less time consuming than traditional manual methods. And it can also give you a probability confidence value. So if the species ID is a low confidence, you can go in and manually ID it if you want to as well. It's currently only auto IDs UK bat species and small mammal species, but it's been developed further for bird species. And then there's another company called Wilder Sensing, and they're using song meter microsensors and artificial intelligence analysis to monitor bird species in Somerset. And then they've, over the last 7 months, they've produced over 300,000 audio records from just 4 sensors, and they've managed to pick out really key species, including the cuckoo, snipe, Chetty's warbler, and lapwing. At Ecosylus, we're also piloting the soundscape monitoring approach, which I mentioned, on several different rewilding sites. And on a pocket rewilding site, which has been left to recover and regenerate after being a horse pasture, we deployed audio moths and applied some of the acoustic indices to test this approach. And this figure shows the results from the Bioacoustic index, which is a value computed from both loudness and number of different occupied frequency bands. So you can see a spike in the morning for both lines in May and September, which could be an indicator of the dawn chorus. And the spike is earlier in May, which could indicate the breeding bird season, and also the sunrise was earlier. Although the Bioacoustic index is also quite sensitive to geophonic and anthropogenic background noise. So as I mentioned, it's important to bear that in mind when analysing the data. So more recently, researchers are discovering that listening to the soil soundscapes can be a fascinating way of understanding below ground biodiversity without invasive survey methods and soil sampling. So studies have shown that soil in restored forests have more complex sounds than degraded sites or agricultural sites. And this kind of indicates that soil sounds could be a proxy for soil health. And this is an area Ecosylus are starting to develop and explore further. And there's been some really exciting research published recently that I will share with you. So this was a study in an alpine forest in Switzerland, where they studied the acoustic complexity of forest soils relating to biodiversity. And the researchers took a soil sample next to the soil acoustic sensor. And then the animals from the soil sample were extracted and ID'd, and diversity values were calculated. And then they found a correlation between the acoustic complexity index values and also the taxa richness from the soil samples, which was really cool. And then another really recent study in South Yorkshire looked at acoustic diversity in restored forests and a degraded forest. So the restored plot had a much higher acoustic diversity than the deforested plot. Both these studies are suggesting the huge potential to monitor below ground biodiversity using bioacoustics. And if you're interested in listening to what the soil sounds like, if you Google this study, which I've put on the page, then you can actually listen to the audio clips of the forest. It's really, really cool. And then bioacoustic monitoring has also been used in freshwater and marine environments, and this is also an area of research we're starting to explore further at Ecosylus. We can use bioacoustics for freshwater soundscape surveys, coral reef soundscape monitoring, and also cetacean underwater acoustic research. In fact, there was a recent BBC documentary called, I think it was called Our Changing Planet, where they used hydromoths to listen to coral reefs and all the fish talking on coral reefs. It was really cool as well. Next, on my whistle-stop tour of ecology technology is animal movement technology. So why do we need to study animal movement? Well, animal movement is a fundamental aspect of life. It's linked to almost every ecological and evolutionary process: acquisition of food, reproduction and survival, species distribution, genetic diversity, and things like community structure. So in rewilding, we can view ecosystems on these 3 axes, which interact and enable functioning ecosystems. So we've got trophic complexity, which is the size of the food web. We've got dispersal, the ability for organisms to move across space, and then natural disturbances. And all 3 of these components require movement of species. So understanding animal behaviour and movement can give us a huge insight into their habitats and the challenges they may face. This information can also guide us with kind of decisions in rewilding and help us identify suitable habitat for species reintroduction and wildlife corridors. And then perhaps when in the future, when we reintroduce, maybe if we reintroduce large carnivores like the lynx or free roaming bison, or in countries where they're already doing this, it can assist in the prediction and mitigation of human-wildlife conflicts. So the term biologger refers to a data storage tag that can be attached to an animal, and it's used for collecting information on that animal or that animal's environment. So a biologger can incorporate one or many sensors, and these are some of the sensors that we can use. So there's the triaxial accelerometer, and this measures an animal's acceleration along 3 axes, which can provide information on activities such as movement patterns, posture changes, behaviours, and even energy expenditure. Then you've got triaxial magnetometers, which measure the Earth's magnetic field, and this can help determine the orientation or the direction that the animal is moving in. And by analysing that data, we can gain insight into animal navigation and migration behaviours. And then temperature sensors are good for monitoring animal body temperature or the temperature of the environment. Heart rate monitors, great indicator for stress or activity levels. We can also use light sensors and depth and pressure sensors, which can provide insight into different diving behaviours on penguins and seals. And this image on the left is called a daily diary tag. It was developed at Swansea University's Lab for Animal Movement, and it's got an integrated magnetometer and accelerometer and a micro SD card slot. So scientists can combine multiple sensors into a biologger and make them in all kinds of shapes and sizes to tag an animal and relay information about its movement, behaviour, physiology, and its environment. And this is offering really exciting new opportunities for uncovering the hidden lives of animals, especially ones which are really hard to observe, like aerial animals or aquatic animals. It's also important to consider the welfare and ethics when using this technology. Obviously, animals need to be captured and handled when tagging them, so it's important to minimise stress and disturbance, and of course get permission and licenses to handle wild animals. And then the tags must also be less than 2 to 5% of the animal's body weight. And really a lot of effort has to be put into designing the tags to minimise negative impacts on movement. So there's been studies, in this image on the right of the seal, there's been studies using computational fluid dynamics to see different tag designs and locations and how they affect drag in marine animals. And this is why I love this field, is, you know, you have 2 very different sectors working together. You've got ecology, and then also you'll have the engineering department kind of looking at the drag and different tag design. So I don't want to go into too much detail here, but this is just a quick brief overview of the history of animal movement tech advancements. You can see that GPS was first being used in animal movement in the 1980s. And then from 2010, ecologists were really driving the revolution of biologging sensors. And that was often motivated by the need to get ecological data that couldn't be obtained by direct observation. So what's the difference between biologging and GPS tracking? Quite a lot, as you can see from all the text on the slide. So GPS is great for long distance movements and migrations. It's got really accurate location data, but it's not so good for fine scale movement. You know, they can record at 1 hertz, which is once per second, but that would mean you'd need a really large battery. So the higher the frequency of the fixes, the larger the battery you'll need, and the heavier the GPS collar will be. So long-term monitoring, it's more common to get a fix every few hours. The data can be retrieved remotely, and some tags can be designed to drop off after a certain time and send a location signal, so that avoids the stress to the animal by recapturing it. GPS doesn't work underwater or in valleys or in dense canopy due to the satellite signal limitations. Biologgers, however, are generally smaller and lighter than GPS collars, which makes them less intrusive for animals. They can collect different types of data from different sensors, and this kind of versatility means we can ask a much broader range of research questions, and they provide really high resolution data. So you can get really fine scale, and you basically can work out exactly what the animal is doing at any given moment. You can record over 40 kilohertz, which is more than 40 data points a second. And the data can be collected in most environments, so under the water, valley bottoms where GPS doesn't work. However, biologgers don't typically provide direct location data, which makes it challenging to track exact animal location. Although there is a light level geolocation theory, which is a method of using ambient light levels to establish geographical location using some kind of astronomical algorithms. I'm not sure, I haven't looked into it that much, but basically a fundamental trade-off of biologging to reduce size and weight means that data is stored on the device and you can't retrieve it remotely. So often requires physical recapture. But how on earth can you recapture the exact same animal, you may ask? Well, often species return to the same location in a certain time of the year. So migratory species like ospreys might return to the same nest. Sea turtles will return to the same beach to lay their eggs. So often it is doable to recapture the same individual with a bit of luck. And a key biologging sensor is the accelerometer. So accelerometers measure acceleration in 3 axes, so how fast something is speeding up or slowing down. And we have accelerometers on our phones and fitness watches, and those monitor our activity and track our steps. And research has shown, this is really cool, that overall dynamic body acceleration is a really good indicator of energy expenditure. And we can use this equation in the top right called VEPA. You don't need to know what it means, but basically it's the vectorial sum of the 3 acceleration values. And there's some really good research by Bidder et al. That showed that this value, this vector, had a really strong correlation with speed. So we can use VEPA as a proxy for speed. And I'll tell you why this is absolutely brilliant. We can use this information to reconstruct fine-scale animal movement paths, also known as dead reckoning. And this is a really important tool for ecology to fill in the gaps between less resolute GPS data without incurring those extra power costs. So this figure is just an illustration, but it shows the GPS path in red and the dead reckoned path in blue. So you can see that the path shows that the animal did a lot more movement than the GPS path shows. So if we have occasional GPS location data to ground truth, then we can also use, if we combine it with a biologger, we can use information on speed, so using VEPA as a proxy, and then we can also use information on heading, so the direction the animal is going, derived from magnetometer and accelerometer data. And then we can work out exactly where the animal's going in between the GPS fixes to sub-second levels. It's really, really cool. And this might be useful for finding out where an animal is crossing a road, for example, or where they might forage for food that you might not pick up on a GPS track. So these are just a few of the really cool applications of movement technology. I don't know if I've got time to go through all of them, but very briefly, research has, using biologgers on wildebeest with heart rate monitors, body temperature sensors and accelerometers, found that blue wildebeest kind of showed some physiological and behavioural plasticity and resilience, which allowed them to cope with changes in food resources and climatic changes as well. Then there was a study which GPS tagged hedgehogs, and it found that rural hedgehogs travelled further each night than urban hedgehogs, which really highlights the importance that we need to connect urban gardens with hedgehog tunnels. Then this one's really cool. There's the development of a device called a beacometer, which is basically a magnet and a transducer, and you can attach it to a penguin's beak. And it showed information about the size and what type of prey the penguins are eating based on how much they're opening their beak. So you could tell exactly what species of fish, and if it was a squid, that the penguins are swallowing, which is really, really cool. And then there's been long-term satellite tracking in ospreys to understand their migration routes and wintering grounds. There's a tiny tracking device weighing, I think it's less than 300 milligrams, tracking the migration of monarch butterflies. And then there's a study that looked at the dead reckoning paths of badgers and showed that they spent a lot more time near field margins and hedges than GPS data showed. And then finally, there's another bit of movement tech. It's a company called Smart Parks, and it provides advanced animal movement sensors to conserve wildlife. And this tech is used on bison herds in Kransvaak in the Netherlands, and also on the bison herd at Wilderbeleen in Kent, which is really cool. It uses LoRaWAN network, which is a low power, wide area network designed to connect battery operated things to a big network, basically like a long range Wi-Fi. And it can work in areas with no mobile signal and almost at real time tracking. So at Kransvaak, you can see in this map, they have an online map, and it shows the animal locations on the website, which is really engaging, really exciting. When I visited Kransvaak, it was exciting to look on the map. You could see the location of the bison a few hours ago, so it kind of boosted your chances of, it was still difficult to spot them, but it made it more exciting and made it a little bit easier to spot them, which was really cool. So in a rewilding context, biologging allows the continuous movement of reintroduced species. It's helping researchers understand their adaptation to new habitats. It's helping assess habitat suitability and preferences. As I said, biologgers work underwater, so we can tag semi-aquatic species like beavers, which can help inform future reintroductions. And if we ever reintroduce larger carnivores like lynx, could be used to mitigate human-wildlife conflicts. And another really good application I think would be good is tagging deer. It'd be really useful. There's not a lot of data on deer distribution and modelling the impacts on their vegetation. And also, rewilding is more about people really than nature. And biologging and the visualizations of animal movements are really, really engaging and storytelling for public, which is really great. So kind of leading on from animal movement technology, you may have heard of virtual fencing. So virtual fencing is an invisible fencing system where you can set a virtual grazing area on an app, and the grazing animal wears a GPS collar unit. And then when the animal gets close to the virtual fence, the collar will play a melody. If the animal ignores the melody and crosses the fence line, it will get a small electric shock. But animals are super clever and quickly learn to associate the melody with the shock, and then they learn to turn around when they hear the melody. So in the same way, a physical electric fence is a visual cue for some livestock, the virtual fence, the melody acts as an audible cue. And so why is this useful in a rewilding context? If we go back 6,000 years ago, our landscape may have looked a bit like this, dominated by a diverse range of large herbivore herds, aurochs, wild horse, deer, bison, all moving through the landscape and moving because of predators or in search of food. And these herbivores played a crucial role in shaping our ecosystems. And this figure encapsulates kind of the major dimensions of herbivore ecology, that they're powerful effects which are represented by the arrows and indirect effects represented by the dashed lines. So not only are they having these local vegetation effects and effects on soils, but they're also restoring natural processes and controlling carbon exchange between ecosystems and atmosphere, nutrient cycling, and ultimately influencing global climate. So reintroducing natural grazing herbivores is now considered to be one of the most effective ways to accelerate ecosystem upgrading and restore biodiverse landscapes. But when herbivores, often domestic livestock, are kept in high densities and enclosed areas, this may lead to overtrampling, overgrazing and compaction, which can erode soil carbon stocks and damage flora. However, in high intensity, short duration grazing periods, herbivores have these really positive effects on soil fertility and carbon sequestration. So this is where in rewilding we can reintroduce primitive or native domestic breeds to mimic these effects and mimic those historic movements and grazing of the large herbivores through the landscape. But this is really difficult to do if you've got lots of barriers in the landscape or small areas, but virtual fencing is making this possible. So No Fence is a brand of virtual fencing. It was developed in Norway. It's the world's first virtual fencing system. It was actually founded by a Norwegian goat farmer who wanted to utilise the mountainous land for grazing, but was restricted by the difficulty of putting in fences. And there's a 14-day learning period, and they've they found the technology, and we found the technology pretty successful in keeping livestock in within the virtual boundary after the learning period. So the GPS collar looks like this. This is a sheep collar, and it contains solar panels for recharging the battery so it can last long periods of time. It's got a GPS receiver, Bluetooth, and a triaxial accelerometer, which can give us information on livestock activity and an indicator of health as well. So the software can be accessed on a mobile app or an online web portal where you can visualize the herd movements using heat maps. You can see where individuals have been testing the system more, which ones are more active, where they spend more of their time. And you can set your virtual fence boundaries and move the animals between pastures all on the app, which is brilliant, really. And although the technology was first developed for agricultural uses, it's starting to have more applications in rewilding and nature restoration contexts. So we can use the fence to restrict or move large herbivores without a physical fence or without predators. Virtual fencing, it increases that flexibility and increases landscape connectivity. So also in more complex and remote and expansive landscapes, the tech allows farmers to locate their herds on the app and also get information about their health and activity from the accelerometer data. And so no fence allows us to steer ecological processes. We can facilitate that natural grazing movements, we can prevent overgrazing, and we can fence away more sensitive areas that might need protection. So at Ecosystem, we first used 8 cattle collars to test the system for potential future use on rewilding sites. So we collared 8 cows and experimented with pasture design. We cornered off marshy areas and areas where the cattle like the most. And you can see from this figure, the learning period over the first 14 days, the number of audio warnings in blue and compared to the number of electric pulses in yellow, and the number of audio warnings is much, much higher, which indicates that the cattle were more often turning away from the virtual fence after the audio warning. And actually after the 14-day period, there was often hardly any electric pulses. They really had learnt the system. Then after the cattle trial, we deployed 30 collars on a herd of sheep, flock of sheep, as part of a meadow management trial. And after a meadow translocation, so we used the virtual fence to strip graze the meadow to promote grass species to develop stronger root systems. Also, the sheep provided a natural fertilizer and they opened up bare areas for future seed germination. And the farmer was really positive about the trial and the benefits that it was giving him, gave him a lot more flexibility rather than moving a physical fence. And then also the botanists reported that the no fence grazing produced a really good sward length of the desired height. And the no fence had an advantage to the farmer of being much less labour intensive. I really hope you can see this video. I'm not sure if it will come through, but the image on the right should be a video if you can see it. But so we're now exploring ways to utilise sensors and data from the no fence collars. So obviously it's got inbuilt GPS data. We can start to visualise herd movements. And we're also starting to experiment with using no fence cattle and GPS data as like a moving survey transect. So by attaching an acoustic logger, like a micro moth to the cattle as well, we can pick out species from the bioacoustics, but also the location radius from where the species was heard. So although this is not a standardized survey transect, it does open up data possibilities that you might not get from a static acoustic detector. And this could work really well in really expansive sites where the free roaming large herbivores have access to, and understanding where rare or scarce species might be nesting or spending more time on the site. So I've talked a lot about specialised sensors and trackers, but actually with the advancements of mobile devices, most people are carrying around a really useful bit of technology for ecology. There's been an explosion of nature apps and citizen science apps in the last few years, which are exploiting that full range of computational and sensing capabilities in a smartphone, like the compass, GPS, accelerometer, and now with advances in artificial intelligence, nature apps are linking So yeah, nature apps are linking mobile and cloud computing, social networking, big data, and they're really transforming mobile devices into these really sophisticated sensors and kind of like powerful computers, really. So the development and distribution of this technology is empowering collaboration between volunteer citizen scientists and professional scientists. So now we're seeing this exponential rise in the number of citizen science observation submissions. So this is a figure that shows the number of observations made to the citizen science platform iNaturalist, which it stores loads of data on different species observations. So you can see a huge increase in the last 4 or 5 or 6, 7 or 8 years. And again, I hope you can see these videos, but as I've mentioned, the advances in machine learning technology and AI means that now apps have been developed that can auto-ID plants and animals from a photo or an audio file. So Seek on the left is an AI identification app, uses image recognition technology developed for citizen science platform iNaturalist. And as this video shows, it's really easy to ID a plant, and then you can upload the sighting onto the citizen science platform. And then Merlin in the video on the right identifies bird sounds using machine learning technology to recognize species based on spectrograms, which are visual representations of sounds. And both apps are free to download and have proven really accurate. So if you haven't used them before or heard of them, I would really recommend giving them a go. It is really, really cool. So something a bit different. I'm going to quickly delve into eDNA or environmental DNA and how its rapid development is kind of revolutionizing ecological research. So what is eDNA? eDNA is genetic material which you can get from taking an environmental sample such as water or air or soil. And this works because animals release their DNA into the environment when they shed their skin cells through feces, mucus, and other biological materials. And this DNA can be collected and extracted in a lab using different molecular techniques. And one of the huge advantages of eDNA sampling is it's non-invasive. So we can get a huge amount of information without disturbing animals or their habitats. So it's a really efficient and ethical tool for research. So how are we using eDNA in rewilding? Well, we can take soil samples and monitor changes in soil biodiversity, you know, the fungi, the bacteria, the animals. We can also document the return of species and track reintroduction of species like beavers. And we can also quantify the positive impacts in the wider landscape and things like IDing species which are more challenging to ID, like insects and fungi. And compared to traditional wildlife surveys, eDNA is actually quite cost effective and really time effective sampling approach. And it's only going to get more cost effective as the technology improves. So at Ecosystem, we're asking questions about soil health and the best ways to quantify and understand recovering soils. And we used soil eDNA to baseline a rewilding site and to look at the fungal communities and composition and compare it to the neighbouring horse pasture. So as you can see on the left, this is called a taxonomic heat tree, and it shows the number of, it's called operational taxon units, but they're basically taxon levels. And you can see on the left, we've got the rewilding site, which had 157 operational taxon units compared to the horse pasture, which had 126. So the rewilding site had greater taxon richness. But you can get so much data from one tiny sample, you know, hundreds and thousands of species IDs. So it's now understanding what the data means and how we can add meaning to the data. It can be challenging. It's still being researched, but this is going to get a lot easier and easier as we get more reference data sets and this technology develops further. And again, previously at Ecosystem, when monitoring invertebrates or ground beetles, which are a good indicator of soil health, we've used pitfall traps, and then the beetles have been ID'd by an expert with a microscope. And this can be time consuming and quite costly. And it isn't really scalable because you're relying on particular experts around the country. So we're now starting to use eDNA to identify species in samples, which is much more scalable. Although it's important to note that in this sampling situation, you do have to kill the invertebrates in the sample, so not totally non-invasive. And then aquatic DNA is great because, unlike soil, where you often need to take multiple samples to get a good representative sample, you can often get away with taking one or a few because all the eDNA is mixed up together. And ponds are great because they act like these DNA reservoirs. So not only are you getting information from the species living in the pond, but you also will get DNA from species like mammals that go to the pond to drink, because they'll leave behind fragments of their DNA. So you can build up a list of all the species in an area just from a sample from a pond. And then this is a really cool example of where eDNA is being used on a large scale in a recent collaboration between Forestry England, Forest Research and Naturemetrics. Soil samples were taken from a forest in North Yorkshire, and the soil samples detected over 2,400 fungal sequences and over 200 species of invertebrates, including a shrimp-like copiapod. Who knew shrimp were in the soil? It's really exciting because it's opening doors to begin robustly monitoring entire woodland ecosystems and not just focusing on a few indicator species like bats and birds. So we're really understanding how forests are changing in response to climate change. And Forestry England are hoping to start an exciting programme of kind of free data sharing where researchers can share detailed DNA samples. And so having that large reference data set will really add meaning to future sampling. So recent advancements and into the future, there's been a development of portable DNA sequences. So you don't even need to send your samples to the lab now. They're quite expensive, but over time, again, costs will come down. And the integration of eDNA with other technologies like remote sensing or machine learning algorithms. And this can help classify and predict species from eDNA sequences. But obviously, you do need to have enough data to train enough training data to train the models. And again, as I've mentioned, over time, more and more eDNA data collected will mean larger reference data sets and more cost-effective sampling. And a final quick section on camera trapping and AI. I'm aware I'm running out of time. So camera trapping has been used by ecologists for quite some time. It's used to study animal behaviour, estimate population densities, relative abundance, and species occupancy. So camera traps are triggered, basically, if you don't know, by a moving animal, and they'll take an image or a video of that animal. And they're a really cost-effective and non-invasive survey method. Again, they're great because we can send them out to landowners, and that's cheap for the landowner. They can deploy them and then send them back to us. But they do generate a huge amount of image data. And previously, to deal with this amount of data, there's been citizen science platforms like Zooniverse, and this has been used to speed up species identification, where citizen scientists can click through camera trap data and ID species, or say if the pictures are empty. But this is also time consuming. But the recent advancements in AI have meant that we can now use machine learning algorithms to process thousands of images in seconds. And the algorithms perform image classification using a trained pre-labeled data set. So you do need a large volume of pre-processed data and quite some time to train the algorithm first. So to reach a wide audience, several research communities have recently developed platforms that incorporate machine learning into kind of easy to use interfaces, which is great because they've already done the training data set. And these are a few of the examples of platforms that already exist and I've started to explore. And so the images on the right are camera trap images from my garden, actually, and using one of the platforms, Conservation AI, which is a free platform. It's auto-ID'd the animals, and it also gives you a probability, an ID probability, which is good. And then there's another platform called Wildlife Insights, and that's trained 4 million images for more than 150 Australian animals because they wanted to track the recovery after the Australian wildfires, which is really cool. So the same thing with most machine learning, the more and more images uploaded to these platforms or integrated, the better the technology is going to get. So I'm really excited to see this technology develop. So I've touched on just a few technology devices, but there's many I haven't, things like drones and LiDAR, remote sensing, Internet of Things. Would love to hear more if anyone's got any more interesting technology to explore. And looking ahead, the development and deployment of new technologies is going to continue to offer rewilders and ecologists the kind of fantastic, innovative solutions, really. But the challenge is going to be selecting the best ones to use, ensuring that they can work together and getting them into the hands of the people that can use them the most effectively. Yes, so thank you so much for listening. I hope you may have learned something new, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions you may have.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Ella. It's great to hear just how passionate you are about ecology technology, actually. And I'm obviously definitely not an expert working in marketing, so it's been fantastic to hear all about the different tech that we use and can use to kind of add value to nature recovery and rewilding projects. We're certainly seeing a lot more clients now, a variety of different clients asking more about the types of tech that we're using. So it's been really great for me, just, without everybody else on the webinar, to kind of learn more about how we are using tech and how it does add value to the projects we deliver. That's been great. Thank you so much. We've had loads of positive comments in the chat as well, and I've got a few questions to put to you, if that's okay. Hopefully not too taxing. I've just got to go through them all and find them out now. Just bear with me 2 seconds. The first was from Josh. Are anthropogenic noises a problem for data collection in sound monitoring?
Yes and no. So I think I mentioned that a lot of anthropogenic noises are between 1 and 2 kilohertz, whereas the bioacoustic space can go up to 200 kilohertz for bats, but most bird species I think are between 2 and 8. So you can screen out a lot of anthropogenic noise, but also there are birds and there are animals that do make noise in that space, so you don't want to necessarily screen out. And as I mentioned, there's so many different acoustic indices, and they show different things. I think it's best to use multiple acoustic indices if you're looking at the whole soundscape, and some will indicate I can't remember which one it's called, but there's one that looks at the ratio of anthropogenic noise to kind of animal noise as well. So yeah, yes and no, it can be an issue. I think, as I said, if you're looking at using acoustic indices, it's really important to look at the research and see that there can be conflicting reasons for a certain acoustic indice. It's still a developing field, so it's kind of piloting that at the moment.
Thanks, Ella. Next question is from Marie. She's asked, could these sensors be used to monitor animal activity within an urban environment? And if so, how would they cope with human interferences from human activity, such as electronic devices and cars, etc.?
Which sensors are those? The animal tracking sensors?
Yes, I'm assuming so, yeah.
Sorry, what was the question again?
That's okay. No, that's okay. It was quite a long one. Could these sensors be used to monitor animal activity within an urban environment? So that's the first bit. So could they be used in the urban environment? And if so, how would they cope with the interferences from human activity? Obviously, it's a lot louder there. There's lots of cars, lots of tech. Like, how would they cope in that environment?
So in terms of animal movement trackers, there won't be any interference with different. They're by themselves, those sensors. They're not satellite detected. They're not interacting with anything else. You have to, for biologgers, you have to collect that data again. So for biologgers, there aren't going to be any interference really with the noise. There's been a lot of studies in urban environments, like I said, with the hedgehog GPS tracking. They studied hedgehogs in urban environments. In terms of acoustics, if that's what you're referring to, then it can be challenging, because obviously if you're putting an acoustic sensor in an urban environment, there's all sorts of ethical problems with picking up human conversations. You can't get consent from everyone in the city that you might record their voice or something. So there's different ways where you can filter out. Again, you could record only above a certain frequency to pick up if you wanted to pick up bats or if you wanted to pick up birds or something. So you could try and filter out that noise. So there can be challenges in that respect. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Next question is from Paul. Has there been any exploration of how data across species within a bioregion sits alongside one another?
I'm not sure if I understand what that means.
That's okay. No, that's fine. We can come back to you on that one, Paul. I think Chris did answer some of that question, so that's okay. But we can absolutely kind of go back to Paul on that one. And then there was another question from John. Bear with me 2 seconds. Somewhere. How big is the trade-off between using wide-range acoustic monitoring, such as a song meter, versus a more targeted device, such as a bat monitoring device?
Yes, I think obviously on that slide you would have seen they've got quite different costs, with the bat detector really high cost and the audio moth a much lower cost. So the trade-offs, I think, so audio moths aren't recommended to use in industry for like planning and things where you need to know if there's a bat there. The audio sound quality isn't as good. It's still great, and it's great for monitoring rewilding sites because it's not the end of the world if she's 100 meters away. So often in industry where if you're doing a bat survey for a housing development, it's really important to use an industry level bat detector. So again, with the Anabat detectors, they record at a really high frequency, but they're also triggered by bat calls. So they only record the bat species, so they can store loads of data, but they'll stop recording when they don't hear a bat species. So that makes post data processing much easier because all your audio files, you've got a bat in. Whereas with things like song meter and audio moth, especially with audio moth, you just record consistently, or you can choose how long you want to record, and that makes post data processing a little bit more challenging because you've got huge volumes of data to sift through, which is why I mentioned about the BTO acoustic pipeline. So for us, even though you have to pay for the BTO acoustic pipeline, it's a small cost, it's actually much cheaper. And in terms of time costs as well, it's cheaper to use audio moths for us in baselining rewilding sites, and then have that post data processing. It's a little bit more lengthy, but it works out more cost effective.
Brilliant, thanks, Ella. And there's a question here asking in relation to papers and press releases. It might be that we can just send some post-event, but you might have some good ones to think of. Yeah. Are there any papers or press releases from the eDNA forest work? Jack is interested in the climate change aspect of how communities and ecosystems might change.
Yes, there is. I think I can post a link in the chat after, but there's, I think it's Forest Research or Forest England have got a publication or on their website, and I think there's a paper to go along with it. I'm not sure if there's any more updates. They said there's going to be more in the publication. There's going to be more updates later this year, which is really exciting about if we can access the data set and any more information about the data. But yeah, I'll pop the link in the chat after this.
Fantastic, thanks, Ella. And I think that's about all of the questions. We've got 5 minutes to spare, so that's pretty good timing. Well done. Yeah, thank you everybody for coming today. Just to reiterate, we will be sharing the recording with you all. I'll send it all in an email so you've all got it. Hopefully some of you will join our other webinars. We've got one next week, one the week after. And again, we'll be sharing the recordings of those as well. So we really look forward to seeing you all, and thanks for coming along. And thanks, Ella, that was a fantastic presentation.